Oversea Under Stone by Susan Cooper, Chapter 6. "Now then," said Great Uncle Mary as they strode down the hill to the harbor, "it's a splendid afternoon for a walk. Which way do you want to go?"
"Somewhere lonely, somewhere miles from anywhere. Somewhere where we can talk."
Great Uncle Mary looked down at them, from one strained face to the next. His bleak, impassive expression did not change, and he simply said, "Very well," and lengthened his stride, so that they had to trot to keep up. He asked no questions, but walked in silence. They climbed the winding little street to the side of the harbor opposite Kamar Head and the grey house, and followed the cliff path past the last straggling houses of the village, until the great purple-green sweep of the opposite headland rose before them. Up the slope they toiled, through heather and prickling gorse, past rough outcroppings of grey rock patched yellow with lichen and weathered by the wind. There had been no breath of a breeze down in the harbor, but here the wind was loud in their ears. "Gosh!" Barney said, pausing and turning outwards to look down. "Look!" They turned with him and saw the harbor far below, and the grey house tiny on the threading road. Already they were higher than their own headland, and still the rock-scarred slope stretched above them to meet the sky. They turned again and scrambled up the slope, and at last they were at the top of the headland, with the line of the surf laid out like a slow-moving top map below them on either side, and beyond it the great blue sweep of the sea. One big slanting boulder of granite stood higher than any they had passed on the way up, and Great Uncle Mary sat down with his back against it, his legs arched up before him long and knobbly in their flapping brown corduroys. The children stood together, looking down. The land before them was unfamiliar, a silent, secret world of mounded peaks and invisible valleys, all its colors merging in a haze of summer heat. "Hic incipit regnum logri," Great Uncle Mary said, looking out with them across it all, as if he were reading out an inscription.
"What does it mean?"
"Here begins the realm of Logris. Now come on, the three of you, and sit down." They squatted down beside him in a semicircle before the big rock. Great Uncle Mary surveyed them as if he were enthroned. "Well," he said gently, "who tells me what's wrong?" In the quiet, with only the sand of the wind stirring the air, Jane and Barney looked at Simon.
"Well, it was the burglar," he said haltingly. "We were worried."
And then the three of them were all tumbling out the words. "When Miss Withers came the other night, she was asking questions about the grey house and whether we'd found anything. And so did Mr. Withers on the yacht. He asked me about old books. And whoever it was last night, they only touched the books and the old maps. They were looking for it, they must have been, only they didn't know where to look, and they didn't know we already had it. Suppose they know we've got it, they might come after us." Uncle Mary raised one hand, though he did not move. His chin was up. He looked as if he were waiting for something. "Gently now," he said. "If you have found something in the grey house, what is it you have found?" Simon felt inside the rucksack. He drew out the case and handed the parchment to Great Uncle Mary. "We found this." Great Uncle Mary took the parchment without a word, and gently unrolled it on his knees. He gazed at it in silence for a long while, and they could see his eyes moving over the words. The wind on the headland whined softly round them, and although, as they watched, Great Uncle Mary's expression did not change, they suddenly knew that some enormous emotion was flooding through him. Like an electric current, it tingled in the air, exciting and frightening at the same time, though they could not understand what it was. And then he raised his head at last and looked out across the hills of Cornwall, rolling far into the distance, and then he breathed a great sigh of relief that was like a release from all the worry of the whole world. "Where did you find it?" he said, and the three children jumped at the quiet, ordinary tone of his voice, as if it brought them out of a spell. "In the attic. There's a great big attic all full of dust and junk. We found a door behind our wardrobe and a staircase leading up." "I found it," Barney said. "I threw my apple core away, and I went to get it back because of the rats, and I found the manuscript by accident."
in a corner under the floor. What is it, Gummery? What does it say? It's terribly old, isn't it? It's important. Is it buried treasure?
In a way, Great Uncle Mary said. His eyes seemed dazed, unable to focus anywhere, but there was a twitching at the corners of his mouth. Somehow, without smiling, he looked happier than they had ever seen him look before. Jane thought, watching, it is a sad face usually, and that's why there is such a difference. He laid the manuscript down on his lap and looked from Jane to Simon to Barney and back again. He seemed to be searching for words. You have found something that may be more important than you can possibly realize, he said at last. They stared at him. He looked away again over the hills. You remember the fairy stories you were told when you were very small, once upon a time. Why do you think they always began like that?
Because they weren't true, Simon said promptly. Jane said, caught up in the unreality of the high remote place, because perhaps they were true once, but nobody could remember when.
Great Uncle Mary turned his head and smiled at her. That's right. Once upon a time, a long time ago. Things that happened once, perhaps, but have been talked about for so long that nobody really knows. And underneath all the bits that have been added, the magic swords and the lamps, they are all about one thing. The good hero fighting the giant or the witch or the wicked uncle. Good against bad, good against evil.
Cinderella, Aladdin, Jack the Giant Killer.
And all the rest. He looked down, his fingers caressing the curving edge of the parchment. Do you know what this manuscript is about?
King Arthur, Barney said promptly, and King Mark. Simon found the names in Latin.
And what do you know about King Arthur? Barney looked round triumphantly at his captive audience and drew breath for a long recital, but somehow found himself stammering and said,
Well, he was the King of England, and he had his knights of the Round Table, Lancelot and Galahad and Kay and all of them, and they fought jousts and rescued people from wicked knights, and Arthur beat everyone with his sword Excalibur. It was good against bad, I suppose, like you said, about the fairy stories, only he was real.
Great Uncle Mary's quite pleased smile was flickering again. And when was Arthur King of England?
Well, Barney waved his hand vaguely, a long time ago. Like in the fairy stories, Jane finished for him. I see, but Gummery, what are you trying to tell us? Was King Arthur a fairy story too?
No, Barney said indignantly. No, said Great Uncle Mary. He was real, but the same thing has happened, do you see? He lived such a long time ago that there's no record of him left. And so he's become a story, a legend as well.
Simon fidgeted with the strap of his rucksack. But I don't see where the manuscript comes in. The wind over the headland stirred Great Uncle Mary's white hair, outlined against the sky, and as he glanced down, he looked magisterial and severe.
Patience a little, and listen carefully now, because you may find this difficult to understand. First of all, you have heard me talk of Logres. It was the old name for this country, thousands of years ago, in the old days when the struggle between good and evil was more bitter and open than it is now. That struggle goes on round us all the time, like two armies fighting, and sometimes one of them seems to be winning, and sometimes the other, but neither has ever triumphed altogether, nor ever will, he added softly to himself, for there is something of each in every man. Sometimes over the centuries this ancient battle comes to a peak. The evil grows very strong and nearly wins, but always, at the same time, there is a leader in the world, a great man, who sometimes seems to be more than a man, who leads the forces of good to win back the ground, and the men they seem to have lost.
King Arthur, Barney said.
King Arthur was one of these, Great Uncle Mary said. He fought against the men who wanted Logres, who robbed and murdered and broke all the rules of the battle. He was a strong and a good man, and the people of those days trusted him absolutely. With that faith behind him, Arthur's power was very great. So great that in the stories that have grown up since, people have talked about him having magical help. But magic is just a word. I suppose he didn't win, Jane said with sudden conviction, or there wouldn't have been any war's sense. No, he didn't win, Great-Uncle Mary said, and even in the clear afternoon sunshine he seemed with every word to become more remote, as ancient as the rock behind him in the old world of which he spoke. He wasn't altogether beaten, but he didn't altogether win. So the same struggle between good and evil sides has gone on ever since. But the good has grown very confused, and since the ancient days of Logres it has been trying to regain the strength it was given by Arthur, but it never has. Too much has been forgotten. But those men who remembered the old world have been searching for its secret ever since, and there have been others searching as well, the enemies, the wicked men, who have the same greed in their cold hearts as the men whom Arthur fought. Great-Uncle Mary looked out into the distance, his head outlined against the sky like the proud carved head of a statue, centuries old and yet always the same. I have been searching, he said, for many, many years. The children stared at him, awed and a little afraid. For a moment he was a stranger, someone they did not know. Jane had a sudden fantastic feeling that Great-Uncle Mary did not really exist at all, and would vanish away if they breathed or spoke. He looked down at them again. I was beginning to know that this part of Cornwall held what we sought, he said. I did not know that you children would be the ones to find it, or what danger you would be putting yourselves in.
Danger? Simon said incredulously.
Very great danger, said Great-Uncle Mary. Looking him full in the face, Simon swallowed. This manuscript, Simon, puts you all right in the middle of the battle. Oh, nobody will stick a knife in your back. Their methods are more subtle than that, and perhaps more successful. He looked down at the manuscript again. This, he said more normally, is a copy.
A copy? Said Barney. But it's so old.
Oh, yes, it's old. About 600 years old. But it's a copy of something even older than that, written more than 900 years ago. The part at the beginning is in Latin.
There, I said so, Jane said in triumph.
Simon stuck out his lower lip. Well, I translated bits of it, didn't I? Not much, though, he confessed to Great-Uncle Mary. I couldn't recognize any of the words. I don't suppose you could. This is medieval Latin, not like the Latin you learn in school. It's written by a monk who must have lived near here, and I think about 600 years ago, though there's no date. He says, roughly, that near his monastery an old English manuscript had been found. He says it tells of an old legend from the days of Mark and Arthur, and that he has copied out the story to save its being lost, because the manuscript was falling to bits. He says he copied out a map that was with the manuscript too. Then all the rest underneath is the story that he copied out, and you can see the map right at the bottom.
If the original manuscript was so old that it was falling to bits 600 years ago, Barney said, bemused.
Simon broke in impatiently.
Gummery, can you understand the copied-out part? It's not Latin, is it?
No, it's not, said Great-Uncle Mary said. It's one of the early English dialects. The old language that used to be spoken centuries ago, but it's a very old form of it, full of words from the old Cornish, and even some from Brittany. I don't know. I'll read it out as best I can, but I may turn it into a rather curious English. You may, and I may have to stop. And there we will pause.